Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment my life started to unravel, though I didn't recognize it at the time. My wife, Rebecca, and I had been married for 6 years, and from every angle, it looked like we were thriving. We had a cozy house in the suburbs, stable careers, and a love story that people admired. Rebecca was my partner, my best friend, and the woman I believed I would grow old with. At least, that's what I told myself. Rebecca was the kind of person who lit up a room without trying. She had this magnetic energy that pulled everyone in, co-workers, strangers, neighbors. I loved watching her navigate social gatherings with ease, her laughter bubbling over like champagne. I used to feel lucky to be the man who stood beside her, the one who got to see her at her best and worst. But things began to change about a year ago. At first, it was subtle, small things that could easily be explained away. She started spending more time on her phone, claiming it was work-related. She seemed distracted during our dinners, as if her mind was elsewhere. I chalked it up to stress. Rebecca had recently landed a leadership role at her marketing firm, and it wasn't unusual for her to bring work home with her. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, she announced she wanted to start a family. 4 years, we'd agreed that kids would come later, once we were more settled. So, when Rebecca told me she was ready to have a baby, it took me by surprise. I remember her exact words, "I don't want to wait anymore. I feel like it's the right time." There was something in the way she looked at me that day, a combination of urgency and vulnerability. She seemed so earnest, so certain. How could I say no? I'll admit, I was hesitant at first. Parenthood was a huge step, and I wasn't sure we were ready. But Rebecca's excitement was infectious. She started talking about baby names and browsing Pinterest boards for nursery ideas. Seeing her so happy made me want to go all in. I loved her deeply, and I wanted to give her everything she dreamed of. We stopped using protection that month, and soon after, she began tracking her cycle with the precision of a scientist. It felt like a new chapter for us, one filled with hope and possibilities. I imagined what our life would look like with a baby, a mix of sleepless nights, chaotic mornings, and a love so profound it would redefine everything. But reality had something far darker in store. The cracks in our relationship started to show when Rebecca became increasingly secretive. Her phone was always within arm's reach, and she'd grown more careful about keeping the screen angled away from me. One night, as we sat on the couch watching TV, I noticed her texting someone with an intensity one hadn't seen before. When I casually asked who it was, she brushed it off with a laugh. "Just a work thing," she said. I wanted to believe her, but the more I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut, the more it grew. Rebecca was a private person by nature, so I convinced myself this was nothing out of the ordinary. Besides, she was putting so much effort into trying to conceive, tracking ovulation, taking prenatal vitamins, even cutting back on caffeine. If she was hiding something, why would she be so committed to starting a family with me? Then came the day she told me she was pregnant. I'll never forget the look on her face when she showed me the positive test. Her eyes were brimming with tears, her hands trembling as she held the little stick. "We're going to be parents," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I pulled her into my arms, overwhelmed with a mix of joy and relief. For a moment, all my doubts and suspicions melted away. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca threw herself into preparing for the baby. She started reading parenting books and making lists of things we'd need for the nursery. It was as if a switch had flipped, and the woman I fell in love with was back. I wanted to believe that this was the start of a new era for us, a stronger, happier marriage. But deep down, something still felt off. The first real red flag came during one of her prenatal appointments. I had taken the day off work to go with her, eager to hear the baby's heartbeat for the first time. As the nurse set up the ultrasound, Rebecca seemed unusually tense, her fingers gripping the edge of the examination table. When the image of the tiny flickering heartbeat appeared on the screen, I felt a surge of emotions, excitement, awe, and an overwhelming sense of love for this little life we'd created. But Rebecca's reaction was different. She smiled. Yes, but it felt rehearsed, like she was playing a role. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that pregnancy was a whirlwind of hormones and emotions. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing roots. Rebecca's pregnancy should have been a time of joy and connection, but instead, I felt a creeping unease that I couldn't shake. She seemed excited enough, on the surface, at least. She spent her days researching strollers and car seats, decorating a Pinterest board full of nursery themes. She gushed to friends and family about our growing family, but at home, in the quiet moments when it was just the two of us, there was a strange distance. It was hard to put my finger on it at first. I told myself I was overthinking things, that the stress of impending parenthood was making me paranoid. Rebecca had always been a little guarded about certain parts of her life, her work friends, her phone, but I'd never had any reason to doubt her. And yet, something felt wrong. One night, about 3 months into her pregnancy, I woke up to find her missing from our bed, groggy. I shuffled through the darkened house, thinking maybe she was in the kitchen grabbing a late-night snack, but when I reached the living room, I saw her sitting on the couch, bathed in the cold blue glow of her phone. Her face was tense, her lips pressed into a thin line as she stared at the screen. "Rebecca," I called softly, trying not to startle her. She jumped, fumbling with the phone before shoving it under a couch cushion. "Oh, hey," she said, forcing a smile. "I couldn't sleep. Thought I'd scroll through some baby forums." Her tone was breezy, but her body language told a different story. Her shoulders were rigid, and she avoided making eye contact. I glanced at the cushion where she'd hidden her phone, my stomach twisting into knots. "Baby forums," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Anything interesting?" "Not really," she replied quickly. "Just a bunch of moms arguing over cloth diapers versus disposables." She let out a hollow laugh, the sound falling flat in the empty room. I nodded, though I didn't believe her. Something about the way she'd hidden her phone felt calculated, almost guilty, but I didn't push it. Instead, I sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. She stiffened at first, then relaxed into me, resting her head on my chest. I told myself it was nothing, that I was being overly suspicious, but that night, as we lay back in bed, I couldn't fall asleep. The weeks that followed only added fuel to my growing doubts. Rebecca started acting more secretive than ever. She'd leave the room to take phone calls, claiming it was work stuff, and would quickly swipe her phone screen whenever I walked by. Her excuses always seemed plausible, but the nagging feeling in my gut refused to go away. I confided in my best friend, Eric, one night over beers. Eric was the kind of guy who always kept things real, even when the truth wasn't easy to hear. When I told him about Rebecca's strange behavior, he didn't sugarcoat his response. "Man, I don't want to jump to conclusions," he said, "but you've got to trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is." I nodded, sipping my beer in silence. Eric was right, of course, but the question was, what was I supposed to do about it? Rebecca and I were about to become parents. This wasn't just about us anymore, there was a child involved now. The stakes were higher than ever, and I felt trapped between my suspicions and my desire to keep our family intact. The breaking point came during Rebecca's baby shower. It was a beautiful, sunny afternoon, and our backyard was filled with friends and family. Rebecca was glowing in her maternity dress, laughing and chatting as she unwrapped gifts. From the outside, everything seemed perfect, but as I watched her from across the yard, I couldn't shake the feeling that her laughter was hollow, her smiles forced. Then I noticed him. A man I didn't recognize stood near the edge of the gathering, sipping a glass of lemonade. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and an air of casual confidence. I couldn't quite explain it, but there was something about the way he looked at Rebecca that set off alarm bells in my head. It wasn't just friendly, it was intimate, like they shared a secret. Throughout the party, I kept an eye on him. He stayed on the periphery, never drawing too much attention to himself, but every so often, I'd catch him glancing at Rebecca, and each time, she'd quickly look away, her cheeks flushing pink. When the party was winding down, and most of the guests had left, I cornered Rebecca in the kitchen as she cleaned up. "Hey," I said casually, "who was that guy, the one by the lemonade stand?" She froze, her back to me. For a moment, I thought she hadn't heard me, but then she spoke, her voice a little too calm. "Oh, that's Mark," she said. "He's a co-worker. I invited a few people from work to fill out the guest list." "Why?" I studied her face, searching for any cracks in her composure. "No reason, just didn't recognize him, that's all." Rebecca nodded, turning back to the dishes. "Yeah, he's new, quiet guy, doesn't really talk much." Her explanation seemed reasonable enough, but the way she avoided looking at me told a different story. As I left the kitchen, I glanced back over my shoulder and saw her staring out the window, her expression unreadable. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the pieces started to click into place. Rebecca's sudden desire to have a baby, her secretive behavior, the way she acted around this Mark guy, it all pointed to something I couldn't ignore anymore. I didn't know exactly what was going on, but I knew one thing for sure, I was going to find out the truth. The gnawing suspicion had grown unbearable. Mark's appearance at the baby shower was the final straw, and I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Rebecca's sudden desire to have a baby, her secretive behavior, and the way she lit up, or tensed up, around him felt like puzzle pieces that didn't belong to the picture I thought we were building. I decided it was time to stop giving her the benefit of the doubt and start looking for answers. I wasn't proud of what I did next, but I justified it to myself as a necessary evil. Late one night, while Rebecca was asleep, I crept downstairs to the kitchen. Her phone was always glued to her side, but I remembered she'd left her work laptop on the counter earlier that evening. It was a slim chance, but worth a shot. I booted it up, my heart pounding in my chest. Thankfully, Her password hadn't changed, it was still her favorite childhood pet's name. Once I was in, I navigated to her email. My hands shook as I scrolled through the inbox, searching for anything that might give me a clue. Most of it was mundane work correspondence and spam. But then I found it, a folder labeled personal. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the trackpad. Part of me wanted to shut the laptop and pretend I hadn't seen it, but another part, the part that couldn't let this go, urged me to open it. Inside the folder was a string of emails between Rebecca and someone named M. The content wasn't explicitly damning at first, polite exchanges about meeting for coffee, joking about stressful work projects, but the tone was too familiar. There were inside jokes, casual flirtations, and then, one email that stopped me cold. It was from about a week before she announced her pregnancy. The subject line read, "Can't stop thinking about last night." My stomach twisted as I clicked on it, dreading what I might find. I know we said we'd keep this simple, but I can't stop thinking about last night. You're incredible, Rebecca. I've never felt this way about anyone before. Rebecca. Mark, we agreed this wouldn't get messy. Please don't do this. We both have lives. And this, it was supposed to stay uncomplicated. But it isn't uncomplicated, is it? You feel it too. I know you do. I can't just pretend this didn't happen. Rebecca. Mark, I need time to figure this out. Please don't push me. I'll call you when I can. I sat there in stunned silence, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on my chest. My mind raced as I tried to piece it all together. This wasn't just some fleeting flirtation, this was an affair. And the timing, right before she got pregnant. My stomach churned as a horrible thought crept in. Was the baby even mine? I closed the laptop and returned to bed, my heart pounding so hard I was sure Rebecca would hear it. She lay there peacefully, her hand resting on her stomach, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming wave of anger. How could she lie to me like this? How could she let me believe we were starting a family together while carrying someone else's child? I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying every interaction I'd ever had with her, every moment that now seemed tainted by her lies. By the time the sun rose, I had made up my mind. I needed proof. The next day, while Rebecca was out running errands, I contacted a private investigator. I knew it was extreme, but I wasn't going to confront her without concrete evidence. If the baby wasn't mine, I needed to know. And if it was, I needed to understand the extent of her betrayal before deciding what to do next. The investigator, a man named Carl, was professional and discreet. I handed over the details, Rebecca's schedule, her work address, and the emails I'd found. He assured me he'd get to the bottom of it. Don't confront her yet, Carl advised. Let me gather what I can first. You'll want to approach this with all the facts. It was good advice, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. Over the next 2 weeks, I found myself hyper-aware of Rebecca's every move. Each smile, each laugh, each loving gesture felt like an act designed to cover her tracks. Then, one day, Carl called. His voice was grim. I have something, he said. We need to meet in person. When we met at a diner the following evening, Carl slid a manila envelope across the table. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a stack of photos and printed reports. The photos were like a punch to the gut. There was Rebecca, sitting in a coffee shop with Mark, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Another photo showed them walking through a park, her head resting on his shoulder, but the one that broke me was of them kissing outside what appeared to be a hotel. I followed her to a motel on her lunch break. Carl explained quietly. They were inside for about an hour. I'm sorry. I nodded numbly, flipping through the rest of the photos. The printed reports detailed text messages and phone calls between Rebecca and Mark, all pointing to a relationship that had been going on for months. That night, I confronted Rebecca. I waited until we were both seated in the living room, the manila envelope in my lap. She noticed my expression and frowned. What's wrong? She asked, her voice laced with concern. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I pulled out the photos and spread them across the coffee table. Her face turned ghostly pale as she stared at them, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. What is this? She whispered, her voice trembling. It's the truth, I said, my voice cold and steady. So tell me, Rebecca, how long has this been going on, and is the baby even mine? Her silence was deafening. Rebecca stared at the photos scattered across the coffee table, her face drained of all color. Her lips trembled as she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to decide whether to lie her way out of this or come clean. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. My heart was pounding in my chest, but my voice was ice cold when I finally broke the stalemate. Rebecca, I said, I'm only going to ask this once. How long has this been going on, and is the baby mine? Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let myself feel anything. Not anger, not pity, nothing. She had manipulated me for months, and now I needed the truth. no matter how ugly it was. It's not what it looks like, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't you dare, I snapped, my voice rising for the first time. Don't you dare insult my intelligence by saying that. I have proof, Rebecca. Photos, emails, timelines. So tell me the truth, or I'll find out some other way. Her shoulders sagged as the fight drained out of her. She wiped at her tears with trembling hands, avoiding my gaze. It started a few months before I got pregnant, she admitted, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the coffee table to keep myself steady. And the baby? I asked, my voice barely above a growl. Is the baby mine? Rebecca's sobs grew louder, but she didn't answer. That was all I needed to know. The betrayal was written all over her face. How could you do this to me? I demanded, my voice cracking. I trusted you, Rebecca. I built my life around you. And now, what? You're carrying his child and letting me think it's mine. I didn't know how to tell you, she wailed, her face buried in her hands. I was scared. Okay, I was scared of losing you, of ruining everything we've built. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. You ruined it the moment you decided to sleep with him. Don't put this on me. She tried to explain herself, but her excuses were pathetic. She claimed the affair wasn't serious, that it was a mistake fueled by stress and loneliness. She insisted that she still loved me, that she never intended for things to go this far, but nothing she said could undo the damage she'd caused. By the time she finished talking, I felt like I didn't even recognize her. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd married, was a stranger to me now. I need to know for sure, I said, cutting her off mid-sentence. We're getting a paternity test tomorrow. Rebecca looked panicked but didn't argue. She must have known she had no leg to stand on. The next morning, we went to the clinic. The test itself was quick and clinical, but the waiting was excruciating. Every time I looked at Rebecca, I felt a surge of anger and heartbreak. How could she sit there, knowing she'd destroyed our life together, and still pretend to care? 3 days later, the results came back. I opened the envelope in the car, my hands shaking. Rebecca sat beside me, silent and pale. As I read the words, my worst fears were confirmed. The baby wasn't mine. I let out a bitter laugh, crumpling the paper in my fist. You really did it. You let me think this child was mine, knowing it wasn't. You've lied to me every single day. Rebecca tried to reach for me, but I jerked away. I didn't want to lose you, she said, her voice breaking. I thought if I could just make it work, you'd never have to know. Make it work, I spat, turning to glare at her. Rebecca, this isn't some mistake you can fix with a heartfelt apology. You've ruined everything. I drove home in silence, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to throw her out of the house and never look back, but another part of me, the part that had been betrayed so deeply, wanted something else, something colder, more calculated. Rebecca didn't deserve my forgiveness, and she wasn't going to get it. She'd taken everything from me, my trust, my future, my chance at fatherhood, and left me with nothing but pain. I was going to make sure she regretted every choice she'd made, starting with the one that brought Mark into her life. As I sat in our driveway, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, I felt a dark sense of clarity. Rebecca wasn't the only one who could play this game, and I was about to rewrite the rules. The house was unbearably quiet that night. Rebecca had retreated to the guest room, giving me space. Not that it mattered. There was nothing left to say. Her betrayal was now an indelible stain on our marriage, one that no amount of apologies could wash away. But as I sat in the darkened living room, staring at the crumpled paternity test on the coffee table, I realized something. I wasn't going to let this end on her terms. Rebecca had stolen from me, not just my trust, but the life I thought I was building. She had the audacity to manipulate me into believing I was the father of her child, all while carrying another man's baby. She thought she could walk away from this with just a few tears and half-hearted excuses, but she underestimated me. The first step was finding Mark. I wasn't going to let Rebecca keep this secret buried. He needed to face the reality of what he'd done, and so did she. Using the details I'd gathered from the private investigator, I tracked him down to his apartment. It wasn't hard. Carl's report had included his address and even a few notes about his work schedule. I waited until I knew Rebecca was at work, then drove to Mark's place. My heart raced as I climbed the stairs to his unit, every step fueled by anger and a dark sense of purpose. When I reached his door, I knocked loudly, refusing to give myself time to hesitate. Mark answered after a moment, looking confused. He was taller than I expected, with the same smug confidence I'd seen in the photos. "Can I help you?" he asked. "You're Mark," I said flatly. Yeah. Who's asking?" "I'm Rebecca's husband," I said, watching the color drain from his face. "Can we talk?" His eyes darted around the hallway, as if searching for an escape. I don't think I stepped closer, cutting him off. Don't worry, I'm not here to fight. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. About the baby. The words hit him like a freight train. His jaw dropped, and he stepped back, letting me into the apartment without another word. Inside, the place was a mess: pizza boxes, clothes strewn about, half-empty beer bottles on the counter. It was a stark contrast to the polished image Rebecca had created. I wondered if she'd ever been here, if this was where she'd betrayed me. You know about the baby? Mark asked, his voice shaky. I nodded, folding my arms across my chest. I know everything. The affair, the lies, and now, I know that child isn't mine. So congratulations, Mark, you're going to be a father. He sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. She didn't tell me. I swear, I didn't know. I scoffed. Spare me the excuses. You knew she was married. You knew what you were doing. Mark looked up. Guilt and panic etched on his face. I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't mean for this to happen. Neither did I said coldly, but here we are. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice. You're going to take responsibility for this, Mark. No more hiding behind Rebecca. She's been lying to both of us, and it's time you step up. Do you understand me? He nodded slowly, swallowing hard. Yeah, I get it. Leaving Mark's apartment, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction, but confronting him was only the beginning. If Rebecca thought she could manipulate me into playing along with her fantasy, she was sorely mistaken. It was time to dismantle the carefully constructed world she'd built, piece by piece. The next step was her job. Rebecca had always been fiercely proud of her career, but I wondered how much her co-workers knew about the woman they worked with. Did they know she'd carried on an affair with a colleague, that she'd lied to her husband about the paternity of her child? I made an anonymous call to her HR department, carefully detailing her relationship with Mark and providing dates and emails as proof. While I didn't know if they would act on it, I knew it would shake her world. At the very least, it would force her to face the consequences of her actions outside the safety of our home. My final act of retribution was more personal. Rebecca had humiliated me, taken everything I'd trusted her with and turned it into a joke. She didn't deserve the comfortable life she'd built on the back of my love and loyalty. That weekend, while she was out shopping, I packed my things. I left her a letter on the kitchen counter, short, to the point. Rebecca, I gave you my love, my trust, and my life. You took all of that and threw it away. I've done my part by confronting Mark and informing your workplace about your behavior. Now it's time for you to live with the consequences. Don't contact me. The divorce papers will come soon. Goodbye. I took one last look at the house, the home I'd thought would be the foundation of our family, and walked out the door. As I drove away, a strange sense of peace washed over me. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebecca and Mark would have to figure out how to navigate the mess they'd created, and I would have to rebuild my life from scratch. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was in control. The days after I left Rebecca were a blur. There's no guidebook for rebuilding your life after something like this. The love of my life had betrayed me, the child I'd been preparing for wasn't mine, and everything I thought I knew about my marriage was a lie. But as the dust settled, a strange clarity began to emerge. I realized that while Rebecca had taken so much from me, she hadn't destroyed me. I wasn't going to let her. I spent the first few weeks at a friend's place, crashing on his couch while I got my affairs in order. Eric, my best friend, was more supportive than I could have hoped. He didn't press for details or try to offer empty platitudes. He just gave me space to vent, to rage, and, when I needed it, to sit in silence. You'll get through this, man, he said one night as we shared a couple of beers. And when you do, she'll be nothing but a bad memory. The divorce process was as messy as I expected. Rebecca's initial reaction to my letter had been a flurry of phone calls and messages, apologies, pleas, even anger when I ignored her. She claimed she wanted to make things right, but I wasn't interested in her version of right anymore. When the papers arrived at her doorstep, she tried a different tactic: guilt. She begged me to come back, to think of the good times we'd shared. But there was no going back for me. Not after what she'd done. My lawyer handled most of the heavy lifting, ensuring the process was as smooth as possible. Rebecca fought to keep the house, which I gladly relinquished. It was tainted with too many painful memories. I walked away with my savings intact and the knowledge that I'd cut ties with her forever. One unexpected source of closure came from Mark. A month after I left Rebecca, he reached out to me. At first, I considered ignoring him, but curiosity got the better of me. We met at a quiet coffee shop, and to my surprise, he looked as wrecked as I felt. I don't know why I'm here, he admitted, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I guess I wanted to say I'm sorry. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. Sorry for what? Sleeping with my wife or pretending the baby wasn't your responsibility? He flinched but didn't try to defend himself. Both. Look, I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I didn't think about anyone but myself, and now I'm paying for it. Mark explained that Rebecca had cut ties with him after our confrontation. He was struggling with the idea of fatherhood, and from the way he spoke, it was clear he wasn't handling it well. Part of me wanted to relish his misery, but instead, I just felt tired. Good luck, I said as I stood to leave. You're going to need it. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding. I found a small apartment downtown, a far cry from the suburban home I'd shared with Rebecca, but it was mine, and that was enough. I threw myself into work, picking up extra projects to keep my mind occupied. I started going to the gym again, finding a release for all the pent-up anger and frustration. Therapy was a turning point for me. At first, I was reluctant to go, but Eric convinced me to give it a shot. Sitting across from a stranger and laying my soul bare wasn't easy, but it helped more than I ever expected. My therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Karen, didn't let me wallow in self-pity. Rebecca's actions say more about her than they do about you, Karen said during one session. You're not defined by her betrayal. You're defined by how you move forward. Moving forward wasn't a straight path, but it was one I embraced. I started saying yes to things I'd once avoided, happy hours with coworkers, road trips with friends, even the occasional awkward date. Slowly but surely, I began to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. About a year after I left Rebecca, I found myself at a park, watching a group of kids play tag. Their laughter filled the air, and for the first time, the thought of fatherhood didn't feel like a punch to the gut. I realized that while Rebecca had taken away my first chance at being a father, she hadn't taken away my hope. One day, I'd have that chance again, with someone who truly deserved to share it with me. I haven't heard from Rebecca since the divorce was finalized. Occasionally, I wonder what became of her and the child, but those moments are fleeting. She's no longer a part of my story, and I've made peace with that. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that betrayal doesn't have to define you. It's a wound, yes, but wounds heal. And when they do, they leave scars, not as a reminder of the pain, but as proof that you survived. And I did survive. More than that, I thrived.